Halo, a series that had always eluded me during my formative years. I had been a PlayStation kid for a while when Combat Evolved first released, and that never really changed as the series grew. I went all through middle and high school with my PlayStation 1, 2, and 3. I love those consoles, as well as my Nintendo handhelds, but it certainly was a lonely experience. It was the era where every teenager had Xbox and Xbox 360, and they were playing cooperatively and competitively online. I remember countless lunch periods where all my friends raved about the newest Halo multiplayer, knowing damn well that I wouldn't be a part of it. To be clear, it didn't bother me. Like I said, I was quite content replaying my single-player PS2 games over and over again. I'm looking at you, Sly Cooper. It was the good life, but I walked it solo. However, those lunchroom stories stuck with me. Those days of teenage wonder, listening to my friends describe the incredible combat, beautiful worlds, gripping story, and intense multiplayer left a lasting image in my mind. And at the center of it was the Master Chief, the epitome of legend to teenage boys of the 2000s. In recent years, my gaming tendencies, preferences, and habits have expanded greatly, and for the first time, a Halo game was on my radar. Halo Infinite, touted as the new beacon of hope for the franchise, was releasing. At the time, I still didn't have an Xbox, but my interest was piqued. Soon, things would change. Earlier this year, I invested in my first ever Xbox by purchasing a Series S. Game Pass quickly proved its worth to me, and after familiarizing myself with this foreign controller that almost seemed blasphemous to hold, I decided it was time. I wanted to play Halo. I wanted to see what all my friends from back in the day had enjoyed so much, at least in terms of the single player. So, I downloaded the Master Chief Collection, as well as Guardians and Halo Infinite, and I got to playing them. Cataloging my thoughts on them seemed like it would make for a good video, so here we are. And as a quick note before we jump in, I'll be limiting this video to the single player campaigns of each title. And I know this is heresy, given how monumental online multiplayer has been for the series, but I just don't have the time to experience each title's multiplayer to its fullest extent. So forgive me for that, but without further ado, these are my takes on the campaigns of the Halo games. You know, after witnessing the monumental hype of my friends all those years ago, and having over a decade for those visions to stew in my mind, well, Combat Evolved feels kinda bad. Well, at least in 2022, that is. I think the most critical part in understanding my perspectives throughout this video is that I am a complete newcomer to the series. Expect reminders of that because it is important. Outside of getting smeared in a few random multiplayer matches at my cousin's, I was never exposed to Halo. And hopefully this allows me to see the games without the nostalgic filter, but it's still replaced by a different influencer, the passing of time. Combat Evolved released in 2001, 21 years before the making of this video. It instantly proved itself as a must-own game for Xbox players at the time, but it even surpassed that lofty accomplishment by being a true system seller. Halo revolutionized the first-person shooter, and was a critical stepping stone towards making the genre one of the most dominant forces in the years to come. From regenerating health to crazy new sci-fi weapons, and a distinct focus on storytelling, they all proved to be major successes that many FPS games would adopt moving forward. At the heart of Halo's success was the 30 seconds of fun gameplay loop, first outlined in an interview with Bungie developer Jamie Griesemere many years ago. He said part of Combat Evolved's success was because it found a way to create an engaging, action-packed 30-second gameplay loop that could be repeated throughout the entire game. The idea being that if the player bought into the initial combat enough, it could be extrapolated over the course of an entire game while not sacrificing player enjoyment. I really wanted to read this full interview for further context and research, but for some reason, the Joystick website was inaccessible to me, and the only thing I could find was the now famous quote. Regardless, in the years since its release, this quote has been held up as the gold standard that defines the success of the Halo franchise. But honestly, I only saw this come through in bits and pieces as I played through Combat Evolved. Part of this goes back to what I was saying just a few minutes ago, about the passing of time. I'm by no means a genre expert, but after enjoying games like Titanfall 2 and Battlefield 1, it's hard to go back to a game like Combat Evolved. I don't see many fans touting the first Halo as the easiest to go back to, so I'm willing to give this title a bit of a pass for not holding up, especially since it did get a lot right the first time around. So let's get a bit more detailed here and talk about what I liked and didn't like with the first Halo. What jumps out immediately about CE is the characterization of the world and its inhabitants. Even in 2022, this game feels full of life and mystery. We're thrown into the action immediately as an attack on the human colony ship, Pillars of Autumn, has forced the hand of the Earthlings, requiring them to awaken the legendary Master Chief, a seemingly all-powerful badass warrior capable of dealing with any threat.
Your architecture isn't much different from the Autumn's.
Don't get any funny ideas.
This opening tutorial level sees us getting down the basics for movement and shooting, but it also goes a long way in introducing our primary enemy, the Covenant. These alien-like creatures seem hell-bent on wiping us out, but I love the small details within their tiered ranks. You have heavy hitters like these yellow assholes who can just one-shot you, but there's also basic soldiers, elite guards, and my favorite of all, these little grunt dudes who run in fear at your very sight. Seeing you slaughter a few of their friends sends them running away, cursing your name and peeing their pants in fear. It's a great way of establishing the ranks of these soldiers without outright telling us them, but it also does a great job of alluding to the status that Master Chief holds. It's good stuff. Touching down on Halo for the first time is also an incredible moment, as the graphics hold up even all these years later. Seeing that stunning ring surrounding the planet was incredible. It was beautiful to look at, but it also provided mystery, because what the hell is it? What's its function? Hell, at this point I didn't even realize that I was actually on that ring, and I love that moment of realization. I also loved being able to switch back and forth between the remastered graphics and that of the original game. For the most part, I stuck with the original look just to see how it really was, and it still found ways to impress me all these years later, particularly the outdoor locations. As we moved further into the planet to discover its secrets, I was thoroughly impressed with the small but incredibly creative arsenal that we're gifted. You have your standard assault rifle, shotgun, and pistol, but there's also powerful missile launchers, as well as some alien tech, like plasma pistols, and perhaps most interesting of all, the Needler. This shoots tiny needles that track the enemy and explode, leading to massive damage and destruction. I loved it. By going down the science fiction route for their FPS, Bungie was able to flex their creativity and deliver a satisfying assortment of weaponry to wield. And the cool part is, just as the encounters with the Covenant start to feel stale, Bungie introduces a brand new faction of enemies called the Flood. These swampy alien creatures look like early artwork of Vilgax from Ben 10, at least to me, but they were pretty cool. They have exploding variants, melee soldiers, and big dudes who pack powerful guns. The exploding ones are amazing because shooting them is like a chain reaction that kills many of their surrounding comrades. The Flood are tweaked to be different enough from the Covenant enemies that they feel new, despite having a lot of similarities. It made for a refreshing change of pace around the midpoint of this title. Hell, in later missions, you'll even see these factions fighting against one another, which is awesome. In the early game, your human companions fought alongside of you, and in the late game, enemies fight one another. It's another factor that helps breathe life into this game and make it feel far more realized than many FPSs that came before it. And finally, the simple but effective story keeps the player's interest without taking too much time away from the action and gunplay. Most of it is about uncovering the secrets of this alien world, and there's a plot to save the universe from utter destruction. You know, run-of-the-mill stuff for this genre. Master Chief lands on an alien planet, he discovers a parasitic all-consuming species, and looks to contain it without submitting to an aggressive AI's plan to fix the problem by destroying all life in the galaxy. He succeeds, but there still proves to be many threats lurking out there in the universe. Despite any familiar plot beats and lack of meaningful character growth, there's still a decent story here, especially for 2001 standards. This comes from an era where storytelling in games was just starting to catch on, and finding a way to contextualize your level within a greater narrative wasn't a given yet. It was in its infancy, and Halo proved it could be done well, especially with how well it handled environmental storytelling. So, interesting sci-fi weapons, good world building, characterized enemies, simple but satisfying gunplay, and a mascot to anchor it all made Combat Evolved a success. At least that's what seems apparent to me. But in 2022, 3 elements really drag down the experience: pacing, reused areas, and the checkpoint system. Pacing is perhaps the game's smallest issue, but it does feel like many areas within a few levels drag on for far too long. In particular, the mission where Master Chief storms the Covenant HQ goes on forever, with very little to switch things up or keep your interest. This issue wanes though as the game goes on. Reused areas are another major issue with Combat Evolved. I don't necessarily mean going back to a previous location, that happens a lot, but it's usually been changed since your first time through to reflect what has transpired there since. Instead, I'm talking about how often the game will just reuse the same hallways and rooms, particularly in stages like Assault on the Control Room, the Library, and 2 Betrayals. In some cases, you'll go through the same room 3 or 4 times with no variation or differences. This, paired up with the pacing issue of some levels I mentioned earlier, leads to a lot of boring bits where you hardly feel a sense of progression. Sometimes it's even worse, as you can become completely lost. And finally, the most damning thing about my first Halo experience was the checkpoint system. I started this game on the normal difficulty and played about halfway through until I reached a point of immense frustration. So, when you die in CE, you spawn at the previous checkpoint, but your health and ammo does not restore. So, if you reach a checkpoint with 1 tick of health left, and there's no health pickups nearby, you're just doomed. You can either beat your head against the wall by attempting to push onward, or you can restart the entire mission. Neither of these options felt good, and since I just was looking for the experience, not the challenge, I bumped things down to easy mode. And it's crazy how much faster you can complete levels on this difficulty, as only explosions are really capable of doing you in. A quick fix would be to respawn players with full health and full ammo and letting them carry on from there. I hope to see this fixed in the next game, as I do plan to try to play through each game on normal. For now though, it really got on my nerves and turned me off from the original Halo. Oh, and the final mission makes you drive a warthog to complete it, and the controls are just awful. It's unforgivable. Because of these issues, playing Combat Evolved in 2022 feels like reading an important but dated historical document. You can respect it for its accomplishments of its era, but there's really no reason to go back to it unless you're curious, or you're new to the series, or are craving a taste of nostalgia. Be wary though, your rose-tinted glasses might get a bit smudged. Regardless, it's impossible to deny the strengths of this original title. Hell, it was received so well that it quickly became Xbox's signature franchise, with Master Chief being its undisputed mascot. And that's a pattern that has continued all the way through to current day. It created a fascinating new world with a superstar mascot to navigate it, while taking the player on a tour through a galaxy unlike any they had known before. And at the heart of it all was a simple but compelling gameplay loop. Find aliens, kill aliens, complete your mission. Despite the shortcomings, it was clear that Bungie and Microsoft had struck gold here, and a sequel would give them tons of opportunity to improve on what had come before.
Halo. It's finished.
No. I think we're just getting started.
Halo 2 released in 2004, and it must have been a pretty anticipated title by a lot of young gamers, especially after the success of the first title. After playing through the campaign of this sequel, I feel pretty comfortable in assuming that many of them were not disappointed by this offering. I'm sure many folks took advantage of the split-screen multiplayer in Combat Evolved, but Halo 2 was revolutionary in another way. It was the first Halo game to offer online competitive multiplayer, a facet that many fans took advantage of then, and still do to this day. It was the perfect storm, as the online infrastructure came together in time for the release of a title that was hyped to the moon after the original's killer launch for Microsoft's first console. Again, I won't be tackling the multiplayer of any of these titles, but it can't be understated just how critical that component was to the success of Halo 2. But even going beyond that is how it warped the trajectory of the video game industry. It's often viewed as the first successful competitive online experience to reach a massive following in gaming history. On console for sure. At least that's what I read online. Again, I was too busy celebrating getting a PlayStation 2 for my 10th birthday. Still, even in the single player, it isn't hard to see the dramatic improvements that this sequel brought to the franchise, as it cleaned up a lot of the missteps from the original title, while also finding new ways to pump in more action, more thrill, and more intrigue into the gunplay and the story. But honestly, the first thing I want to discuss is how relieved I was that the level design has been improved so drastically. Levels no longer feel like the same set of hallways and outdoor environments repeated endlessly, as instead, each arena feels like it was custom built to not only provide a fun place to shoot space guns, but also like its own distinct area that's a small part of a bigger whole. The sense of progression alone benefits drastically from this, as moving through an arena and reaching a brand new one is something the first game really struggled with. Here though, it feels like you're actually moving through a level, instead of going through a loop of the same rooms over and over again. The levels do contain some backtracking, but not nearly as much as the first game, which makes the player feel like they're getting shit done, not backpedaling, and that aligns nicely with the confident and strong demeanor that Master Chief provides. But it's more than just avoiding the copy and paste temptation, as these levels are full of arenas with lots more elements within them. There's arenas that contain multiple levels that adds in a layer of verticality to the combat formula. There's also more bottomless pits, which encourage players to be more mindful of their footing. And then there's also some pretty sweet sections with moving platforms, such as this one where you're riding a massive mechanical gondola across a large lake. Coolest of all is when you get to hop to other platforms, kill the Covenant, and then hop back to your gondola to continue pressing onward. It feels like a futuristic spaceship takeover, and it's sick as hell. So yeah, the advancement in level design is probably the most notable improvement in Halo 2's campaign, at least for me. With that being said though, there's a lot more elements to celebrate. The checkpoint system in Halo 2 is leagues better than the original for a couple reasons. First, and perhaps most influential, is that your overshield has been buffed, and your health bar has been removed. This means that your health is always rechargeable, meaning you can get back to 100% at any time. You don't have to worry about getting down to the red parts of your health bar and hitting a checkpoint. This guaranteed frustration in the first game, as you always respawn with the same amount of health as you had when reaching the checkpoint. Here though, it's a non-issue and it makes things much smoother. Not to mention, Halo 2 is more gracious with the number of checkpoints it allots you, even going so far as to provide new ones if you're struggling in a particular area. If you die a couple times during a tough stretch, the game will make new checkpoints for you to respawn at so that you don't have to repeat as much content as before. It really helps with the flow of progress, making Halo 2's gameplay pacing much better than the originals. Gunplay feels about the same as it did in Halo, but the team had still found ways to improve it, such as through implementing new weapons, as well as by introducing dual wielding. I didn't use it a ton, but it did feel pretty badass to charge into battle with two guns blasting at those Covenant bastards. The only unsatisfying part of this was that you couldn't dual wield the same two weapons, which made things a little unsymmetric at times. But really, how could I complain with some of the new weapons that have been introduced, such as the SMG and the Sentinel Beam? Most iconic though must be the Energy Sword, that is now usable after it was strangely not an option in Combat Evolved. It felt so good to pick this thing up and slash at my foes with visceral uppercuts that sent them back to hell in a hurry. Such a legendary weapon in video game history, and wielding it for the first time, it just felt special, it really did. Leaping around the layered battlefields and unloading the clips in my weapons and slinging grenades everywhere was a ton of fun. I felt firmly in control of the action, but still threatened at times, leading to ducking and cover to build back up my energy shield before rejoining the fray. Once again, fighting alongside companions and seeing rival factions fight against one another was nothing short of impressive and inspiring. Halo 2's set pieces are far and above those of the original game as well, and so it's not hard to see why this sequel was such a slam dunk. Another component of the gameplay that I didn't touch on when discussing Combat Evolved was the game's usage of vehicles. Halo 2 follows suit, but just like with every other aspect of the game, it found ways to improve it. The biggest problem with Warthogs and Ghosts in Combat Evolved is that you had to turn them by turning the entire camera, and it just wasn't as responsive as it needed to be. It led to many instances in which you felt like a helpless passenger instead of a confident driver. That problem is fixed here in Halo 2, as you can turn vehicles with ease, at least landlocked ones. This fix alone makes them light years easier to control, which allows you to enjoy the heavy firepower you wield while in one. There's a few sections of this game dedicated completely to vehicle traversal, and they provide some of the most explosive and fun set pieces to experience. This is especially true when mowing over foot soldiers while watching as tanks, speeders, and planes from rival factions bombard each other to smithereens. To put it simply, I groaned whenever I came to a vehicle section in Combat Evolved, but it excited me to find a speeder, a ghost, a banshee, or whatever while playing through Halo 2. Of course, I still haven't talked about one of the most impressive components of this sequel, and that would be the bold decision to split time between playing as Master Chief and as a Covenant outcast known as the Arbiter. How on earth I didn't know about this twist is beyond me. It seems like this one ought to be on a ton of those biggest twists in gaming lists that people make. But despite my overexposure to video game content, I never knew about this. And boy did it make for a wonderful surprise. Before we get into it, I must give credit to Bungie for being so confident in their talent that they would go down a route like this. It could have easily flopped and pissed off a ton of people. See The Last of Us Part 2 16 years later for that. But Halo 2 didn't. Not at all. It made Halo 2 better, so let's see how. The game of course starts with you taking the role of the Master Chief once more, as you and your crew are celebrated for your victory over the Flood and Covenant after the events of the first game. The good times are short-lived though, as your ship and Earth itself are attacked by a Covenant fleet. You'll spend the first few missions repelling Covenant forces in space and at home, including this awesome bit where you leap your way into a massive destroyer and blow it up from the inside. That was sweet, but after this, things take a drastic turn. At the beginning of the game, we're shown cutscenes of what happened to the Covenant commander after his failure to protect the first Halo ring. We're shown as he's tried and convicted of treason, his torture sessions, and then a twist of fate, where the prophets grant him status of Arbiter, a role offered to superb elites in times of despair. It was all a bit confusing at first, like, why are we seeing this? How is it relevant to Master Chief? Sure, it furthers our knowledge on the Covenant, but why do we need to know this if Chief doesn't? Well, it's simple. We're going to spend half this campaign playing as the Arbiter. Mechanically, he handles almost identically to Master Chief, except he's granted a short-lasting invisibility mode that allows him to infiltrate enemy lines much more quietly than Chief could dream of. You can feel how enemy encounters are different with this trick in your back pocket. As Chief, you just have to blow your way through there, but as the Arbiter, the option to sneak past is always on the table, so long as you're efficient with your movement. But despite how impressive a difference this small tweak makes, I don't want to get bogged down on his gameplay, because it's what he brings to the narrative that makes Halo 2 so compelling. In Combat Evolved, the Covenant were just the bad guys, because that's what we were told. But in Halo 2, they're expanded on much further because of how often we play as the Arbiter. We come to see them as more than just our enemies, but instead as a civilization, and as a culture. We get to see the hierarchy of their society, which can be summed up as the all-seeing prophets on top, with all the subservient soldiers and civilians below them. Of course, even within that soldier status, we find different ranks. We always saw this as Master Chief, but it's here in Halo 2 where we come to understand it more. It's through the Arbiter's eyes that we come to see the betrayal of the prophets, as they cast aside their elites and allow for the beast-like brutes to become their royal guard. This leads to civil war throughout the Covenant, but the Arbiter remains faithful to the Council, at least until they betray him and cast him aside after he obtains the device to weaponize a new Halo ring.
There are things about Halo even the hierarchs do not understand. Take care, Arbiter. what you say is heresy, is it?
As players, we feel this divide in the Covenant not only in the cutscenes, but also in the gameplay, as we're constantly joined by our brethren in battle against the traitors early on, and the brutes as the game progresses. Bullets, laser beams, and grenades fly loosely and liberally throughout the battlefield, leading to a much grander sense of palpable conflict. Through all of this, we come to sympathize with the Arbiter's plight, as we know he wasn't a heretic who betrayed the Covenant. It's simply that he was bested by us, playing as Master Chief. We can respect him for his loyalty to the Council, as he graciously accepts his second chance in becoming the Arbiter, fully knowing that it's a road that only leads to death. And then we get to see him reevaluate his allegiance and faith once the Council betrays him, realizing that his fellow elites are the only thing that matters anymore. He serves as a brilliant foil to Master Chief, and allows us to further our comprehension of the Covenant as well as the wider Halo universe as a whole. His playable inclusion was an absolutely gutsy call that paid off immensely in the end, in part because of the small gameplay twists, but more importantly for its contribution to the world building and the storytelling. Continuing with this trend of Bungie's confidence, the game ends on a cliffhanger. Brought together by a flood creature called the Gravemind, Master Chief and the Arbiter learn that the Covenant's promise of safety upon fulfillment of the prophecy is a lie. The two are teleported to stop the Covenant from gaining control of the Halo superweapon. Master Chief infiltrates the Covenant ship, wipes out many higher-ups, and boards another ship on its way to Earth. Meanwhile, the Arbiter is sent to stop Tartarus after he steals the icon to activate the Halo ring. In one final showdown, we defeat the newly appointed Brute leader and stop the activation of the Halo ring we're currently on, which unfortunately activates remote detonation for all the rest of the rings within the galaxy. 343 Guilty Spark claims that the only way to stop it is to reach a station called the Ark. Meanwhile, Master Chief is headed to stop the Council of the Covenant. And that's it. The game ends on this note. It did what God of War 2 did years before Kratos could. The development team got away with this cliffhanger because of how amazing this game was when compared to its already beloved original, not to mention the strength of the multiplayer. It also ensured that Halo 3 would be massively hyped, leading to a level of anticipation Xbox hadn't seen before. What a gutsy gamble that paid off. Well done. In terms of negatives, I can really only offer nitpicks on this game, as it succeeded in addressing many of my criticisms from the first title. I do still think they're worth mentioning though. Sometimes the audio in this game is just straight up bad. Like, anytime a character was talking through a microphone, I had no clue what they were saying, which led me to be lost a handful of times. Also, the jumping back and forth between the Arbiter and Master Chief occasionally had me feeling lost, as I had to think back a while to remember what each of them was doing the last time I played as them. And finally, I do think the last 2 or 3 missions of this game are some of its weakest from a gameplay perspective. The game just insists on spamming high-level enemies at you and says, good luck on the gauntlet. The levels are shorter to compensate for this, but it still led to a lot more deaths than I had experienced before in any of the other levels, so it was a bit steep for a difficulty spike. Regardless, even from a distance, it wasn't hard to see how Halo 2 took everything from the original game and made it bigger and better. They expanded on the storytelling, world building, level design, weapon variety, graphics, and more, leading to an impressive second offering in this legendary franchise. Often, people tell me that Halo 3 is the best in the series, but Halo 2's level of quality makes me seriously question that. Only time will tell. About a week for me anyway. For you? Well, the answer to that is coming up right now.
This is Spartan 117.
Can anyone hear me? Over.
Isolate that signal. Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Alright, yeah, I was wrong. Halo 3 is a significantly better game than Halo 2 in almost every way. Released in 2007, and often viewed as the pinnacle of the series, Halo 3 took all the strengths established in the previous game and tightened and polished them to make the most free-flowing and fun combat the series had seen yet. In terms of campaign flow, all movement from aiming to navigation to vehicles and more, it all feels smoother, while gunplay feels more visceral, fast-paced, and impactful than ever before, leading to probably the best first-person shooter experience I've ever had. And that's quite an incredible feature for a 15-year-old game. On top of that, what stunned me immediately about Halo 3 is how significant the presentational jump from Halo 2 to this title is. The graphical difference jumps off the paper immediately. Part of this is due to the Master Chief Collection containing only one enhanced version for Halo 3, but even taking a look at gameplay from the original title, it's a day and night difference. The only stumble Halo 3 took for me personally was within its story. Not that it was bad, but simply that it chose to take on a more focused narrative instead of one that builds the world as much as Halo 2's. So let's take a look at these elements in further detail. Well, hold on, not just yet. I know the comment section will eat me alive if I don't mention that Halo 3's multiplayer was arguably the best the series had ever delivered, because of the improvements to gunplay along with the online infrastructure Microsoft and Xbox had developed in the 3 years following Halo 2's release. Perhaps equally as important was the introduction of the Forge, a legendary and beloved mode that allowed players to build and customize their own game maps for competitive play. As if building entire maps on your own wasn't enough, Halo 3 featured far more custom game mode options than Halo 2 did, providing an almost unbelievable amount of creative freedom and therefore replayability to this title. The sheer joy these features must have brought players back in the day is incredible, and it can't be understated. And learning about this has helped me to greatly understand why so many people have been heartbroken that Halo Infinite's online options are quite meager. But for now, let's refocus on the campaign of Halo 3 to see what it has to offer. It was a kind 3 years between Halo 2 and Halo 3, in terms of the game's presentation, but really, that was to be expected. The original sequel came out during the twilight years of the first Xbox, while Halo 3 was built with the 360 in mind. In fact, by the time it released in 2007, the Xbox 360 had already been out for nearly 2 years. The more powerful hardware was always going to allow this game to look better than its predecessors, but what's really impressive about it is how good it looks years and years later. There's plenty of games from 2007 that don't look nearly this good, and it's a testament to the art direction that it's been able to endure so strongly. Environments contain more models, which allows it to feel more realistic, and the texture work is leaps and bounds better as well. Meanwhile, the animation quality has gotten better too, which allows for a more fluid-looking experience, particularly during in-game cutscenes. This goes beyond the graphics and art direction though, as many other striking improvements have been made, such as cleaning up the HUD. Your health bar is now centered instead of confined to a corner, which makes it much faster to sneak a peek at it while not losing focus on brute forces barreling down on your position. It was a smart decision to move the player's health to a more centralized location, as to not take away from their attention on the game world as drastically as in Halo 2. They even included a little filter that resembles the glass visor on Chief's helmet to help you further immerse yourself into the character, and it's a nice touch. The improvements afforded to Halo 3 extend past the graphics though, as it's by far the smoothest and fun to play entry that I've experienced yet. From Chief's movement, to speed, to the feel of different weapons, to reload times, to the verticality afforded by jumps, to animations, and more, everything feels like it was perfectly balanced to make a truly legendary masterpiece within the FPS genre. The faster and more fluid feel of this title is apparent from the opening moments, really the first time you shoot a gun. Things felt pretty good in the previous two games, but it's just been brought to a whole new level here, and it's only assisted by the gorgeous and enduring visuals. I'm not a big fan of FPS games, and I've only played a handful, but this is by far the one I've enjoyed the most in terms of combat.
Thought I'd try shooting my way out. Mix things up a little.
This was the first game in the series in which I genuinely came to understand what Jamie Griesemer meant when he detailed the 30 seconds of fun loop. I, of course, could comprehend what his words meant, but Halo 3 was the first time in which I felt it. In my fingers, in my mind, and in my soul. It just clicked, and I loved Halo 3 because of it. And to be honest, this perfection of the combat loop is what stood out to me most about the gameplay, as the new additions this time didn't stand out quite as much. New weapons like the Brute Spiker and the Gravity Hammer were a ton of fun to use, but ultimately they felt more like another cog in my arsenal of destruction. You see, I wasn't picky about my weapon selection like before, as instead I just grabbed up whatever was available and went to town until the clip was empty and my belt was out of rounds. Shooting aliens was just too consuming and satisfying, so much so that I hardly dabbled with a new set of tools called equipment. These were extras that could be used during battle, such as a cloak to go invisible for a while, or a turret to fire on your enemies, or a bubble shield to provide temporary cover. Most of the time, I ended up forgetting that I was even carrying these, and didn't ever really feel the need to experiment with them. They just weren't that monumental of an inclusion, if you ask me. Again, and I hate to keep harping on it, but the shooting gallery that Halo 3 provided was immaculate, and I think part of this game's success in this department is with how it varied up level design. In the previous Halo games, the goal was usually to travel from point A to point B, and while objectives were sometimes included, they were sporadic and didn't motivate me as a player. That changed in Halo 3, as each new mission has a handful of 2 to 4 objectives to complete. These short-term goals drive the player forward with a sense of progression and purpose, while providing further context towards your actions as the player. No longer are you shooting aliens because they're bad and that's just what we do. But instead, we're shooting them to clear out, a landing zone for Johnson and the Chopper, or something to that extent. Again, these help drive the gameplay forward, and paired up with levels that are considerably shorter than most in Halo 1 and 2, it led to a very free-flowing journey through this game's action, story, and set pieces. I must admit though that I really do think Halo 3 stumbles in its final mission. In the penultimate assignment, you rescue Cortana from the flood-consumed version of High Charity. It's atmospheric, it's full of tough encounters, it's claustrophobic as all hell, and it ends with a bang as you and the Arbiter shoot your way out and just barely escape. It's an amazing mission. It all ends though with you simply returning to a Halo ring, going inside one building, shooting a small number of Flood within a familiar environment, and then the title ends with a driving set piece much like Combat Evolved did. Sure, this ending is climactic, but I'm stunned that they end this game with a vehicle section when the combat is so good. That was a huge letdown to me, especially because I kept falling off the map and having to restart, which robbed the moment of some of its impact. An epic showdown with the Horde of Flood and the Gravemind would have been a lot cooler and on brand for the game. It could have been one last flex on all other first-person shooters for just how far and above this gunplay was over theirs. Alas, we didn't get that, and Halo 3's ending doesn't quite stick the landing because of it. This disappointment extended to the game's overall story, as it reins back the world building of the previous game to instead go full-on summer action blockbuster. Halo 3 concludes the story we've been experiencing over the last two titles, but does so with a much grander focus on what's epic and badass, rather than by expanding our understanding of this world. It seems like the developers felt they had spent enough time setting up the world, the stakes, and the players in the previous two games, and now was just the time to let Master Chief shine in all his badass glory, with weapons, corpses, and explosions on full display. It's dressed up in bullets, blood, and bold action scenes, but ultimately it's a simple story about how Master Chief, aka you the player, saved humanity and the greater galaxy from a Thanos-level threat, while also rescuing Cortana. And to be fair, this seemed to be on par for what to expect from FPS games of the time, so I can't knock it too much. It's just that after how much effort the second game took to build the world, this sort of feels like a regression. It's not bad, but it just wasn't what I particularly wanted. And I think the biggest evidence for why this feels like a step backwards is that the Arbiter is minimalized throughout Halo 3. This once proud and playable character from Halo 2 is reduced in this third game to the designated campaign co-op character, who occasionally offers up his 2 cents in cutscenes. Halo 2 invested me into his story, and despite getting his moment of revenge in Halo 3, it didn't feel special to me anymore. I get that they wanted to round out the trilogy with Master Chief as the main focus, and having you play as the Arbiter wouldn't have meshed with that vision. I'm sure a lot of fans provided backlash to Bungie for this decision in Halo 2, and perhaps this was their approach for course correction. I can't say with certainty, but that's my interpretation from the games alone. The Arbiter's inclusion here just feels so forced. Like, the developers knew they had to include him in some capacity without giving him nearly as much spotlight as before.
Chief, wait! The Arbiter's with us!
Come on now. We've got enough to worry about without you two trying to kill each other.
Were it so easy. We must go. The brutes have our scent.
It kind of reminds me of Rose's reduced role in The Rise of Skywalker after being so prominent in The Last Jedi. And when you're reminding me of the latest trilogy of Star Wars films, well, you're not doing so hot. Anyway, this more focused viewpoint on Master Chief didn't really yield much for me. There's supposed to be some sort of connection between him and Cortana, but after 3 games, I still don't really understand what it's supposed to be. In this game, she shows up a few times in these weird flashbacks, but most of the time, I couldn't understand what she was saying or what it all meant. I knew she got left behind at the end of Halo 2, but I couldn't tell if these were an actual experience Chief was having, or if it was just a hallucination, or a manifestation of the guilt he felt. It all kind of left me confused, especially because in some of the previous games, the audio with Cortana wasn't the best, so I didn't really know what she was saying at all times. And now, I'm just at this point where I don't know how to categorize the relationship between the two. Do they love each other? Are they friends? Do they just respect each other as co-workers? How would they even date? I don't know. It just doesn't really make much sense to me. I guess I'm in the minority here, but I just haven't felt endeared to this relationship after 3 full games. And that's sort of alarming for me. So yeah, I didn't really love the story of this third entry nearly as much as I did in Halo 2. They reserved the spotlight for Chief, but all he's able to muster is some clever one-liners and admiration for Cortana and country before leaping out of it to go shoot more brutes with a battle rifle or a needler. I can respect what this trilogy did for storytelling in the first-person shooter genre, but stories in games have come a long way since, and it's nearly impossible to divorce yourself from that growth. Still though, Halo 3 is a game, and the gameplay elements here are the best I've experienced in the series so far. The gunplay and the visuals have endured the test of time and still feel incredible to play 15 years later, which is something you can't say about most games of that era. So far, each Halo has built on the previous in substantial and impactful ways, and I can't wait to see where the series will go from here. With Master Chief back in cryosleep and set to rest for some time, I'm excited to see where this world goes next. Of course, our next stop won't be too far a departure from this third entry.
I miss you.
Wake me when you need me.
Well damn, that was wrong too. Can you tell I'm writing each section after finishing each game? Halo 3 ODST is different than its predecessor both in some game mechanics and its approach to storytelling. My initial thought that they'd be similar is because ODST was initially DLC, before it grew into its own game. Of course, the success of 3 was so monumental that production on all things Halo was dialed up to 11, and months before the release of ODST, fans of the series were gifted Halo Wars. This story canon entry switched things up drastically though, as it instead played as a real-time strategy game instead of an FPS. Because of that departure, I won't be covering it or its sequel in this video, but I figured it was at least worth a mention. Anyway, back to ODST, and the most notable component of this game for me was its different approach to storytelling when compared to the original trilogy. You don't play as Master Chief during this game, but instead as a platoon of UNSC soldiers. By the way, the UNSC stands for the United Nations Space Command, and has essentially served the role of Earth's representation in the greater space conflict. Master Chief is a super soldier built from this program, at least that's what I'm inferring at this point, but he's absent here in ODST. As previously mentioned, this game focuses on telling the story of a platoon during the assault on the futuristic Earth city of New Mombasa. This event takes place during Halo 2, meaning that despite this game coming out after Halo 3, its story is concluded by the time the events of that game kick off. I could take the time here to recap the story of ODST in its entirety, and share my thoughts on its plot beats, characters, and more, but ultimately, they failed to capture my interest or my intrigue. We'll get to it, but let me start by saying what fascinated me most about ODST is that it proved that what the player wants isn't always good for the actual game being made. You see, after playing through the original trilogy, I was hoping for a game that focused more on characters, telling a story through them, instead of through the events of the plot. Master Chief was a badass, but he was also very archetypical and one-dimensional, and his supporting cast, while memorable, was also pretty one-note. This universe seemed ripe for telling more personalized stories, but now that I've experienced one, all I can say is that you can take the Master Chief out of the Halo, but, well, you shouldn't. As an outsider, I never really understood what made the Green Spartan so special, but it's evident to me now that it goes beyond the cool armor, badass one-liners, and high-powered arsenal.
Master Chief, defend this station.
Yes, sir. I need a weapon.
Right this way.
it impresses me how much he steals the room in some scenes despite only having a line or two to work with. He commands so much admiration for what he represents, the ultimate badass warrior. But putting this to the side, he's truly a liaison between the young teenagers these games targeted and their primal urge to be leaders, to fight, to conquer, and to do so for the betterment and freedom of others. In other words, to be the hero. We never see Master Chief's face because we are meant to step into his shoes, to take on the responsibilities that he has, and to save the universe while feeling pretty slick doing so. He is a medium for players to immerse themselves into, so that they can take part in that power fantasy, and the occasional sick one-liners slot perfectly into that motif. It's just the perfect protagonist for this sort of game, and embodiment of what it means to be heroic and to look cool doing it, while also not stepping on the player's ability to melt into that character. It's funny then that when you take that away, the game just doesn't work as well as you'd hope. In ODST, you play as the Rookie, who is basically Discount Master Chief. Like, extremely Discount Master Chief.
Relax, Rookie. He don't mean nothing. Besides, now's one of those times. Pays to be the strong, silent type.
He doesn't talk, he has no quips, he has no relationship with any of the characters. It's literally just meant to be you. But the stripping away of that tiny bit of personality makes a huge difference. The Rookie feels like a random dude hanging out with his squad mates, because, well, he literally is that. He's not a super soldier who's woken up every time a hostile alien invasion threatens the existence of all life in the galaxy. He's just a guy. Master Chief has the credibility to elevate the player to his level of importance, but also enough wiggle room to allow them to slot themselves in to his role. The Rookie doesn't have that first key element, and it leads to a totally flat experience. My main issue with the story of ODST is that it wants to tell a Halo story, but it wants to do so through characters instead of through plot points. And in this instance, it just fails. ODST proved to me that what I thought I wanted wasn't really what I wanted. At least not in this way. It seems like you're meant to be invested into these characters, but not nearly enough time is given to them to take a liking to them, and form that bond between viewer and character. The main culprit for this is the jumbled approach to telling the game's story, in which you view the events as they happen, but each scene is interrupted with these mandatory bits where you walk around the abandoned city as the Rookie. Instead of experiencing a consistent, flowing story, you get plot beats that are disconnected by tedium. It was a confusing approach to me in the early hours, and when I realized what they were doing, I had already forgotten some of what had already happened because the characters weren't that interesting. The achievement descriptions had me thinking it was building up some sort of mystery, when no. You're just literally seeing what your squad mates did while your character was knocked out in the escape pod. Seriously, this man just laid here unconscious for 6 hours. It's kind of like when SpongeBob ran into the salty Splatoon and slipped on an ice cube. In all seriousness, this disjointed approach to storytelling, along with the lack of time with the characters, ensured that I was never able to take a vested interest as the player. I really struggled to feel a genuine connection between the other games and ODST, despite the similar setting and vernacular. It seemed disconnected, like any generic military shooter, and that was disappointing. While gunplay still remained strong in ODST, in fact it seemed largely unchanged, I did have a few issues with the gameplay. I've already alluded to the first, that being the large empty city streets of New Mombasa that you're meant to walk aimlessly around looking for the beginning of the next mission. This expansive cityscape is home to many buildings, vehicles, and structures that all look identical to one another, making it really hard to get your bearings. It's also pretty dark when compared to the locations of main missions, making it sometimes frustrating to navigate. The openness doesn't funnel the player through the open section as effortlessly as linear levels in previous games, resulting in a lot of times where you just feel lost. Most of the time, Covenant aliens won't spawn in for vast stretches, leaving you to literally just wander around searching for the next beacon. And when you find the location where the beacon is supposed to be, it's still pretty hard to locate it, even if you're using the game's new detective mode, which outlines enemies, companions, items, and points of interest. I guess they just wanted to go for something new, but this semi-open world didn't deliver any fun gameplay situations, atmosphere, or world building, so it really just resulted in feeling like a colossal waste of time. My other main complaint with ODST would be that they've reverted back to the health bar system of the first game. When your shield breaks, you take damage to your overall health, which can only be restored at specific unmarked healing stations. If you lose all your health, you die. I have no idea why they would want to go back to this inferior system. Rechargeable health doesn't make sense within the context of the world, but health you have to actively restore is such a pain. It encourages you to play more cautiously, to spend more time behind cover, and to waste more time looking for health packs. Halo 2 and 3 were about foot on the gas pedal gameplay. All gas, no stop. Here, there's a lot of stop. After experiencing the power fantasy of 2 and 3, this game felt like a big step back in this regard, and so I made the choice to play on an easier difficulty because of it. Funny enough, this broke the game, as I never lost a lick of health after making the switch. I died only once from an explosion. That's it. It made me yearn for the Halo 2 approach to health once more. Finally, there's just a lot less style and color in ODST. The impressive views from the previous games, those rich in color sci-fi scenes, were amazing, but they are severely lacking in ODST outside of perhaps the final mission. They are instead replaced with a lot of drab scenes muted with a lot of black, gray, and brown tones that suck all the life out of a once vibrant franchise. The only primary color I remember seeing a lot of was red, but that was due to the inclusion of a bloody view filter every time you take damage. In previous games, you'd get a quick flash to signal that you took damage, but here the effect lingers. This was super annoying as it often obstructed my view of the enemies. And when you pair that up with the constant switching back and forth between night vision and regular vision, it just led to a lot of inconsistent visuals. It was really disappointing, especially after playing the souped up version of Halo 3. So, I'm sure this might be the biggest shock of the video, but I really did not like this game. ODST was a severe disappointment to me, especially after learning that it had started out as DLC for Halo 3. And perhaps that warped my expectations, as I kinda thought that this game would just continue that storyline, or at least keep a lot of the improvements made to the gameplay. This one felt like the franchise's first miss. While the gunplay remained largely the same, everything surrounding it, from the presentation, to the storytelling, to the old health system, it all just left me yearning for a return to the Master Chief as soon as possible.
What can I say? It was a hell of a night.
Well, folks, Halo continues to surprise. I mean, I just got done talking about how a Halo game without Master Chief didn't work. And then Halo Reach comes along and is like, yeah, you were wrong, you're an idiot. To me, Halo Reach feels like the perfected vision of what ODST was trying to be. Much like its predecessor, Reach tells the story of a special UNSC platoon separate from Master Chief, while also trying to endear you to them through intense gameplay, battles alongside one another, and meaningful story beats. Telling a Halo story that doesn't involve the big green boss man is done so much more impactfully here in Reach, and I can isolate 4 reasons for why that is. Number 1, we spend more time with our squad mates, both as a single unit, as well as in more individual interactions. Number 2, each character has a distinct personality and role on the team. Number 3, the interactions they have extend into the gameplay, leading to a higher sense of camaraderie. And number 4, we've heard about Reach in previous games, but now we get to live through the events firsthand to further our understanding of this universe. The first reason is such a simple one, but it really does end up being the biggest factor for why the approach in Reach trumps that of ODST. The simple act of spending more time with each character, without the constant interruption and sequence breaking, allows for a greater connection to form between player and characters. Early on, we're introduced as the newest member of an elite squadron called Noble Team. We take on the codenames of Spartan and Six, and join the story right as UNSC forces discover the Covenant's presence and invasion plans for the planet. We live out the last hours on Reach and fight back in vain against overwhelming odds. More importantly though, we do so alongside of 5 other characters, most of whom get ample screen time to show you who they are. There's Carter, the leader of Noble Squad, who empowers and inspires his mates with obvious leadership skills. There's tech-savvy and silver-tongued Kate, who isn't afraid to let her voice be heard when necessary. And then there's my favorite, George, or Jorge. It's spelled like Jorge, but I'm pretty sure they call him George in the game. But anyway, he's a large brute of a man with a heart of gold and an uncompromising drive to defend humanity. All of these characters, along with others, get time to show you who they are. Don't get me wrong, this is still very much a plot-driven story, but moments of personality come throughout the game, which helps endear you to your squad mates more. You feel more like a team in this game than you ever did in ODST. Not to mention, your character occasionally talks in this game. He's not just some mute jerk like an ODST. He comes off as a man, not an edgy punk teenager who rebels against society by refusing to speak. I've kind of already alluded to my second point, but yeah, these characters just have more personality than any of the ones in ODST. They don't come off as generic soldiers, but as genuine people, all emboldened and hardened by war in different ways. You can see how their service has shaped them into the men and women they have become. On top of that, they each serve a purpose on the team. Carter is the leader, who often barks out commands for how to form up while out in the field with you. George is a tank capable of dishing out and receiving a lot of punishment while continuing to endure. Yun is a master marksman capable of connecting on long shots with his sniper rifle. And Emil is just the consummate professional, a duty-bound warrior who serves with pride and purpose, willing to eliminate Covenant forces with whatever means necessary. Pairing up with different members leads to a lot of memorable gameplay sequences that are bettered because you can feel a connection to the character and what they mean to the team. And the beauty here is that this sense of brotherhood extends past the cutscenes and goes directly into the gameplay, as fighting alongside others in a Halo game has never been done this well. One of my favorite lines from this game comes extremely early on, when Carter tells you to forget the solo crap because you're a part of a team now, and that's bigger than just you.
Just one thing, I've seen your file, even the parts the Oni censors didn't want me to. I'm glad to have your skill set. But we're a team. That lone wolf stuff stays behind. Clear? Got it, sir.
It's like the game is breaking the fourth wall and telling the player, hey, this isn't a Master Chief story where you single-handedly save the universe. You'll still be important, but it's more about your contributions to the team. Throughout the game, we come to see how that teamwork ultimately gave mankind a fighting chance against the Covenant. It was a cool line that characterized the kind of leader that Carter is, while also informing me on exactly what type of experience I was about to have. So it was damn near perfect. And then the missions start, and they live up to the meaning behind those words. On some occasions, you'll move as an entire unit, while there will also be times where you pair off with another member, like George or Yun, and go about your mission, completing objectives alongside of each other as brothers in arms. This led to so many memorable battles, like infiltrating a Covenant warship alongside of George to blow it up from the inside, or defending Oni Base alongside of Kat, or a desperate final stand against the Covenant alongside of Carter, Yun, and Emil. You could see their skill sets come through while also having assistance like never before on the battlefield. This is enhanced further because other random soldiers will also accompany you in battle at times, which helps things feel more like a war than a one-man wrecking ball. It's all balanced enough that you feel like you're still doing a majority of the work, you're still the badass hero, but also that you aren't alone this time, and are instead accompanied by warriors with equal resolve and might as you. It's fantastic. And it makes moments where you're stranded alone feel all the more impactful. For example, after escaping that Covenant ship I mentioned earlier, you're stranded in the outskirts of a major Reach city, and you're gonna have to fight your way back in by yourself. Without your partners there on the battlefield, or at least in your earpiece, you do feel a sense of isolation. It's used sparingly too, making it all the more worthwhile. Finally, the last major factor for why this story and game work so well is because we know the fate of Reach even before pressing start. Previous Halo games alluded to Reach's downfall, and how it's used as a rallying cry to fire up the remaining forces of humanity. We knew from the start that these characters and the world they inhabit were doomed, but getting to see the destruction firsthand, as well as their efforts to carry on in the face of overwhelming odds, really resonates with the player. Knowing that these characters will perish leads to an anxious effect, where you're just wondering when and how the moments of death will come. And oh boy, do they come. Each character death is tragic in different ways. Yun and Emil die in the moments after delivering Cortana to Captain Keyes, who boards the Pillars of Autumn, setting up the events of Combat Evolved. They got to complete their mission, but it doesn't mean they get to go home. Carter, on the other hand, he sacrifices himself to blow up a scarab threatening our path. It's one last heroic moment of leadership for a character who's guided us wholeheartedly throughout. But it's the death of the final three characters that hit the hardest. George sacrifices himself to manually activate a bomb blowing up a Covenant cruiser.
Bad news is, time is fried. I'm gonna have to fire it manually.
That's a one-way trip.
We all make it sooner or later. Better get going, Six. They're gonna need you down there. Listen, Reach has been good to me. Time has come to return the favor. Don't deny me this. Tell him to make it count.
He dies thinking his efforts saved the humans on Reach, but sadly, they provided but a small road bump on the way to annihilation. And then there's Kat, who dies mid-sentence in a fast and random manner, synonymous with the human cost of war. There's no heroic final stand or memorable goodbye. She's gone in an instant, just like many soldiers in our real world. In a way, you the player are pierced by the emotions of this moment as much as Kat is physically. And finally, there's the death of your character and the fall of Reach. In the game's epilogue, it's just you versus an unending wave of Covenants. This is your final stand. You know you're done for, and your only goal is to go out in a blaze of glory, sending as many elites and grunts as possible to their doom alongside of you. It's symbolic of Noble Team's efforts throughout the game. All of these factors made Reach's campaign a far more gripping experience than ODST's, and that's simply analyzing the game on a story level. Reach also surpasses its predecessor in other ways too, so let's have a look at those. Reach is the game that allowed me to get on board with the concept of a finite health bar in a Halo game. Combat Evolved and ODST both used a similar system, but in those games, the balancing of combat seemed off in creating the intended player experience. These games are power fantasies, and the lack of recharging health sapped the experience of that to a degree. Constantly dying and respawning felt off, especially when it meant respawning in with a depleted health bar because that's what you had when reaching the checkpoint. Reach finally does this system right, because your health bar is more resilient here. If you sustain only a few ticks of damage, it will recover, much like your shield. It provides a nice buffer, but also maintains the integrity of the system because if you get into the red, you'll have to seek out a health pack. Luckily, this game is much more generous and obvious with its manual health stations, making this interaction much more player-friendly. I still prefer the totally rechargeable health of 2 and 3, but Reach does this form better than the other two iterations that came before. On top of that, Reach also brings back the equipment of Halo 3, but makes it a more permanent effect this time around. Instead of picking up a one-use item and then losing it, the equipment mods of Reach are on a cooldown, meaning you can use them more than once. These include a short burst of sprint, an energy shield, a deployable hologram distraction, and an armor overcharge that makes you temporarily immune to damage. Each of these had their moments to shine, but were never mandatory for progression. They were just another tool at your disposal, but being able to use them more frequently certainly enhanced their impact on the gameplay. Level design continued to be a great strength, as Bungie really fell back on their objective-based gameplay. Each mission here feels a bit longer than those of previous games, but because each one contained varied objectives and broke things up with cutscenes, it never really dragged. Hell, the final mission took me an hour to complete, but at no point did I feel like it was getting stale. Maybe that's because this game doesn't end on a vehicle section for once, which felt so nice by the way. But anyway, gunplay remained as good as in previous Halo games, just a total treat to experience. And I won't get into too much detail, but I did really enjoy a lot of the visuals and vistas I experienced in Reach. They felt bigger, better, and bolder than what we had seen before. But this does make sense by this point because developers knew how to get the most out of the Xbox 360. So I didn't remember this until writing this section, but Reach was the last game Bungie ever developed for the Halo franchise. A bit of research reveals they split with Microsoft in 2007, but finished up their contractual obligations, culminating with Reach. I keep reading that the talented Halo developer didn't want to make Halo games anymore, but were made to do so under Microsoft. The power of hindsight does make this a bit weird to me, as they would go on to create Destiny and Destiny 2, which are more first-person shooter games. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's many differences between Halo and Destiny, but its core gameplay loop is quite similar. It's strange to me that they wanted to split, but then just kept making the same style of game. Perhaps there was more going on there than I or we know about, but who knows. What I do know is that Halo Reach made for a wonderful final entry for Bungie's lineage of Halo games. It really feels like everything finally came together for them. They told a meaningful and heartfelt Halo story with rich atmosphere, memorable characters, amazing gunplay, and vehicle sections, all within a beautifully crafted world, both visually and from a design perspective. This feels like the pinnacle of the franchise so far, and I'm interested to see what changed and what stayed the same as 343 Industries were given the reins to create their first Halo game after assisting Bungie for years.
It didn't take long for Reach to fall. Our enemy was ruthless, efficient, but they weren't nearly fast enough. For you had already passed the torch, and because of you, we found Halo, unlocked its secrets, shattered our enemy's resolve. Our victory, your victory, was so close, I wish you could have lived to see it. But you belong to Reach. Your body, your armor, all burned and turned to glass. Everything. Except your courage. That you gave to us. And with it, we can rebuild.
I had no idea what to expect from Halo 4. Without Bungie, would the series take a significant drop in quality, or would 343 Interactive step up to the plate and continue the tradition of excellence the series had been known for? Would they opt to tell another Halo story that didn't involve Master Chief, or would they awaken John 117 from his cryosleep? Would gunplay be as impactful and weighty as it was before, or would it suffer without Bungie's established talent? All of these questions and more were answered right in the game's first mission. I'm not sure if it's taboo amongst the community to say this, but Halo 4 was actually really enjoyable, and I hardly felt any drop-off in quality with this new studio taking over. Remember, I'm analyzing these games solely on their campaigns, not the multiplayer component, which I'm sure has probably made this video interesting for longtime fans of the series to view. That's because those countless all-nighters playing Halo multiplayer with friends is something I haven't experienced. You very well might be sitting here thinking, what's this goon talking about? Halo 2, 3, and Reach were peak, and nothing came close. I wonder how much of those thoughts are influenced by multiplayer. Or am I even right in assuming viewers will feel this way? I guess what I'm trying to say is let me know your thoughts and rankings in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see what others think. Anyway, back to Halo 4. After ODST and Reach took some time away from the Master Chief saga, 343 decided to leap right back into the fray.
Seems like old times.
Ready to get back to work?
I thought you'd never ask.
This must have been a tough decision, as I'm sure it felt like enough time had passed to bring back the legendary Spartan, but with the admiration gamers had for him, any hiccups in the delivery could see players turning against this new studio. I can't help but to wonder what the development team was feeling during the production of Halo 4. Were they confident throughout the process, or did that enormous amount of pressure to deliver the next great Halo experience eat at them? Well, regardless of what they must have felt, in my opinion, they succeeded in making a great Halo game. The biggest difference between 343's first entry and the previous titles is the deepening of the characterization for Master Chief and Cortana. Don't get me wrong, there's still a universe-level threat to overcome, and the plot certainly dictates a lot of the story's arc, but it almost feels like background compared to the relationship between these two protagonists. The Save the World arc is something we've already experienced in Halo games before, and while elements of John and Cortana's relationship have been expressed, it feels much more in your face in Halo 4, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. The conflict in their relationship stems from the fact that Cortana's systems have surpassed the normal 7-year shelf life for an AI. They are starting to deteriorate, making her a less efficient machine than ever before, but it also starts to warp her personality, and there isn't anything she can do about it. It's very much akin to a person suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, as personality traits, quirks, and memories all begin to erode under the weight of aging. She believes that her creator, Catherine Halsey, could maybe save her, but the two are currently trapped drifting through space in half of a destroyed cruiser at the game's outset. Upon awakening Chief, he vows to find a way to get back to Earth to save her. After all, they were first united with the promise to look out for one another. We've seen Chief go to great lengths to save Cortana in the past, but now he's facing a problem that can't be solved with a battle rifle. Of course, Cortana isn't the only one we learn more about here, as a bit of Chief's backstory is further elaborated on. He and many other Spartans were raised from a young age to be the perfect super soldier, despite the human cost this training had on their humanity. This included injections that made him stronger than the average human. These soldiers were brought up to be unrelenting fighters, not functioning members of society. And it leads to this interesting motif where Chief's humanity is questioned throughout the game.
I can give you over 40,000 reasons why I know that sun isn't real. I know it because the emitter's Rayleigh effect is disproportionate to its suggested size. I know it because its stellar cycle is more symmetrical than that of an actual star. But for all that, I'll never actually know if it looks real, if it feels real. Before this is all over, promise me you'll figure out which one of us is the machine.
Is he more machine than human? And this question really helped me to finally understand the dynamic between Chief and Cortana. They bond so well with one another because both are on the fringe of humanity. Both have human qualities and tendencies, but also feel alienated because of the products they've become. They care so much for one another because in a world where they don't belong, they found someone to connect to and identify with while still being able to uphold their sense of duty and purpose. I felt the connection between them more in Halo 4 than all three of the original games combined. It's handled really well and makes the finale where Cortana sacrifices herself to save Chief all the more earned and impactful. Now, in terms of the game's plot, it didn't hold my interest nearly as much as the character dynamics. Despite being introduced to a legendary faction that's been mentioned throughout the series in the Forerunners, I never really felt the threat level the game was attempting to manifest. The Didact is apparently an ancient member of the Forerunners who believes humanity has failed in their attempt to adopt the mantle of responsibility. In other words, humans have failed to become the all-seers of the universe and basically rule over everything. So, as punishment, he plans to wipe them all out and re-establish the strength of the Forerunners as the dominant species in the universe. You follow along with Chief as he and Cortana overcome the odds and find a way to defeat him. Despite the amazing introduction that the Didact gets, I didn't feel like he got enough screen time to become a really solid villain. That's something that the series has struggled with so far, as even the prophets from the original trilogy didn't really do much for me. The massive threat brought on by the sheer number of Covenant troops and vehicles always felt more impactful than any other single beings leading the charge. And that's true once again here. The Didact is built up for the entire game, and then you defeat him simply in a QTE event without any sort of meaningful interaction between him and Chief. It's over in the blink of an eye as he simply gets blown up by the weakest nuclear blast I've ever seen before falling into a pit. It's pretty weak for a series known for its action. And really, the franchise has yet to deliver a good boss fight up to this point, and I hope that's a trend that changes in 5 and Infinite. While their leader may be a weak point, I do have to admit that I love the minions of the Forerunner leader. called Prometheans. These synthetic robots were once human, but have succumbed to the Didact's capabilities. From a gameplay perspective, they introduce a new enemy type into the series for the first time since Halo 2. I'm pretty sure it's been since Halo 2 anyway. But yeah, we've been fighting Covenant and Brutes for so long now that it really feels refreshing to go up against something new. Their attack patterns and movements differ from the Covenant, but the best part is, with new enemies comes new weapons. I really got a lot of enjoyment out of experimenting with the new Promethean weapons, my favorite of which ended up being the Suppressor, which would melt enemies into a pile of flesh or data depending on who was on the receiving end. It felt refreshing to get a hold of some new weapons that didn't necessarily fit visually into what we've seen before. They felt and looked different enough, which led to me experimenting with them a ton throughout the game. Of course, I do believe some of the reason for that is that some of the returning weapons don't quite have the same feel as they did in Halo 3. Part of this was due to inferior sound work, where some guns just sounded completely off, as if they were muffled or extremely warped in some way. They also didn't feel as satisfying to shoot, and I needed a real adjustment period in the game's first few missions to acclimate to the new feel. It almost makes me wonder if this was done deliberately to encourage trying out the new guns, but I can't see a studio purposely sabotaging something in their game just because it wasn't their original creation. Much more likely is the notion that 343 simply failed to fully adapt these weapons into their new game. They were still fun to use, but they felt like a clear step back from their counterparts in Halo 3 and in Reach, as well as the new ones introduced here. Another complaint I do have in this studio transition is that the recovery time for your overshield and health seems to be a bit long in the tooth. There were numerous times where I really felt like I was standing around just waiting for my shield to come back online. It wasn't unbearably long, but when compared to what I've experienced in other Halo games, it was certainly noticeable and a bit annoying. This was especially true when my shield was down. I waited for a few seconds, and it was just about to come back before an enemy connects on a single shot and restarts the entire process. It was just a bit off this time around. Halo 4 also has less missions than previous Halo games, but each of them is longer than your typical entry from the original trilogy. I occasionally felt this increase in length, but for the most part, missions still flow naturally with the use of different objectives to overcome and the transitions between boots on the ground sections and vehicle sections. The only time I really felt the length was when levels restricted my progression path by putting me into these rooms with bottomless pits and waves of enemies. I didn't really enjoy these big sections too much, and it sucks that the game backloaded its levels with a ton of these. The level design wasn't always as strong as previous games, but still beyond passable for sure. And another element worth mentioning is the diversity in the landscapes that you navigate. You spend time on spaceships, on grassy terrain and sandy desert highways, ancient Forerunner factories, the vacuum of space itself, and more. It always felt like I was somewhere new, which was always exciting. So yeah, all in all, I really ended up enjoying Halo 4. The return to Master Chief was handled very well, and the new enemy and weapon types helped make the experience feel fresh again. So in that way, it was a nice blending of new and old. The story also held my interest because it felt like I finally got the more character-driven moments I've been waiting for from Master Chief since Halo 1. I mean, yeah, Reach did its characters justice, but this just feels better because its focus is on the franchise's two key characters. So, all in all, this was for sure an impressive start for 343, and I hope to see that effort continued as we move on to Halo 5.
They say that, like, soldiers and humanity are two different things. I mean, soldiers aren't machines. We're just people. I'll let you have the deck to yourself.
She said that to me once. About being a machine.
Halo 5 Guardians is probably the game where your nostalgia and series admiration affects your opinion the most, because it feels like the riskiest entry yet. I remember in 2015 hearing a lot of hate for this game, but while it's far from my favorite, I don't think it's absolutely terrible by any means. It picks up 8 months after the ending of Halo 4. Master Chief has survived and is leading his own team of Super Soldier Spartans, while a new team called Osiris is introduced and led by another Spartan named Locke. The player splits time between these two teams throughout the game, and while it feels like it's leading to a major conflict, that never really happens. Master Chief has gone AWOL in pursuit of Cortana, who is apparently alive after Halo 4? Having to mourn her once more only for her to return, well, that had to be a slap in the face of series fans. Okay, maybe I do get why they hated this game a bit. But anyway, Osiris is the team tasked with hunting him down and bringing him in, given their belief that Cortana's mingling with the Forerunner system has corrupted her. So basically, you play as a team attempting to find and stop Master Chief, which I guess, yeah, it's not a great jumping off point. It reminds me so much, once again, of The Last of Us Part 2. I can see a lot of parallels between those games. It worked well for Halo 2, but not here. In a way, they both feel like betrayals when you're first exposed to them. This feeling is lesser for me here in Halo, albeit still present, because I haven't had years of compounding nostalgia for the series. So to me, it just seems like a bad choice, while to others it probably was a major issue that pissed off a ton of people. For me, I think the biggest issue with the story is not that you have to spend so much time playing as Locke, but instead how doing so contradicts what's come before. We've played as other characters, but it felt different in the past. ODST and Reach didn't include Chief at all, so those stories felt self-contained. And in Halo 2, playing as the Arbiter was a unique surprise that helped build our understanding of this relatively new world. Here in 5, it feels like a misstep, as making Cortana, and by extension Chief, an enemy for most of the time, it feels like we're betraying not only our icon, but also ourselves. Assimilating yourself into the Chief persona has always been the key component of his character, and so taking the role of hunting him down seems antithetical. It doesn't feel right after we've spent so many games now putting ourselves into his shoes, a character design choice that the developers relied on from the very beginning. It was perhaps necessary to take the story in a new direction after 4 played it pretty safe, but I can understand why fans would be upset. It's such a large step away from the series' roots. What doesn't help is that Locke and his Osiris team simply aren't that interesting, even when you consider that Buck from ODST makes a return. Locke himself is just a straight-laced, by-the-book soldier with very little character development or personality. Yet, we see his face a lot, so he can't take on the same quality as Chief, being able to put yourself into his shoes. I didn't mind playing as him because it didn't change the gameplay, but truly I never felt too invested in his team. This remains true even though it's Osiris that gets to interact with the Arbiter, who makes his return for the first time since Halo 3. That game sort of left the character high and dry, and 5 pretty much follows suit. We get a glimpse into his world and an update on the forces that he leads, but I can't avoid the sneaking suspicion that he was included just as a tongue-in-cheek reference. He's not a necessary part of the story, and it feels like he's included just so the developers could be like, hey, you remember this guy, huh? Yeah, you loved him, didn't you? He was great. Well, guess what? Now he's back. How great is Halo 5?
Kill me or release me, Parasite. But do not waste my time with talk.
And to be honest, most of the sections with Locke and even the Arbiter felt like filler that wasn't necessary for the story being told. It diminishes Chief's contribution too, which feels like a poor choice. So let's talk about our time with Chief and Cortana in this game instead. It's pretty obvious to me that this game would have earned additional bad blood for 343 from the fanbase. You take a duo as iconic as Master Chief and Cortana and split them up, making the latter the antagonist? That's gonna piss off a lot of folks, but I actually think it was a decent choice. We've been down the path of these two saving the world together enough times already. Regurgitating that over again simply wouldn't have been satisfying this late into the franchise. The idea of elevating Cortana's power to universe-level threat and then examining how Chief's relationship with her affects her decision-making, yeah, that's a cool idea. Unfortunately, it just isn't executed well enough here. So let's set the stage. Cortana survives the events of Halo 4 by entering the Forerunner system. She adopts the mantle of responsibility and threatens all natural life in the universe, believing that what she's doing is simply a gift. Meanwhile, Master Chief pursues her. She still seems very loyal to him, but he knows her new vision for the galaxy can't come to pass. There's so many teaser conversations where Cortana hints and eventually reveals her antagonistic role, but it always ends with her saying, "We'll talk more when we're face to face." You play so little as Chief, but nearly that whole time you're just making your way to Cortana. It's boring and it lacks the impact of face-to-face encounters. You spend the whole time just trying to get to Cortana, and then they're like, oh, let's cut away for another lock section. Yeah, that, like, why would you do it that way? But eventually, the two do come face to face, and they just sort of do nothing.
I know we have a disagreement, but once you understand my plan...
Your plan is we do as you say.
I'm offering people a chance to be more than they are naturally.
Like Dr. Halsey did for me.
No. That monster forced you. This is a gift.
Listen to yourself. Stand down, Cortana. Come home with us. It's not too late to stop this.
Stop. No, John. This is too important to stop.
Cortana reiterates her intent and then freezes John before he can do anything in response before the game switches back to Locke's team for the final mission. All the talk you endure during the missions with Chief goes absolutely nowhere. The promise of resolution upon reaching her never takes place. It's anticlimactic and ends on a cliffhanger. Osiris' team is able to stop Cortana momentarily, but she still escapes and is primed to destroy everything. But hey, at least Chief's safe, right? Well, that's it. There's no resolution to this story. It just feels like massive sequel bait, which can be done well, but it isn't here. It's just not enough heart and soul and substance in this story. And it's a shame too, because there was a real opportunity to hit on that theme established in Halo 4. You know, the whole thing about Cortana and John understanding each other because of how neither of them feels like a true human, but instead kinda like a machine. This game could have really explored how that perception of their relationship is contradicted by Chief's awareness that a rogue AI could end all natural life. The previous game brought the natural and created closer, while this game dances around the danger of that notion without ever giving the actors a proper chance to display it. It feels like they were onto something with this, but it just didn't get enough time to develop throughout the course of Halo 5. And because of this, the story feels like a total wash. The direction it went in was a good one in my opinion, a smart new choice, but it just wasn't executed well enough to justify such a drastic change. Speaking of change, Halo 5 does a lot to switch up its gameplay, including more systems, concepts, and mechanics than any other so far. The gunplay remains excellent, but a questionable remapping of the standard Halo button layout was very jarring at first. Reload was moved from right bumper to X, while the former became the new melee button. I got used to it after a while, but there's a decent amount of footage highlighting my initial confusion. I have no clue why they thought this was necessary, but whatever. I guess maybe it's because this game introduces a bit more emphasis to melee combat, but on the whole, it felt pointless. There's now a ground pound and running slam you can do for extra damage, but honestly, I completely forgot about it within a few missions. More important is that word I just used. Running. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the first Halo game where you can sprint indefinitely. And honestly, it felt underwhelming. Just another element to overlook. I'm sure it was huge for the multiplayer, if they included it, but I only ever used it when I died and wanted to get back to that point, or if I had to break down one of those arbitrary walls that were included just to make the running slam seem useful. All of these systems were forgettable. What wasn't forgettable, though, is the fact that you now always have 3 AI companions assisting you on every mission. To be honest though, despite more mechanics being placed onto this concept, this feels like the weakest iteration of this idea yet. In short, it often feels like your companions are brain dead. They either are taking forever to reach the point you've marked for them, or are failing to shoot Prometheans. It still feels very much like you're a one-man wrecking ball. It's a major step back from how Reach made me feel. Their only saving grace was that they can revive you if you die. Now that was nice, and it saved me from respawning a handful of times. However, there were moments where my companions would take my request for assistance, stop shooting, and run over to my heavily surrounded body and then get wiped quickly. And that was embarrassing. This tactical maneuvering was underwhelming to say the least. And so for the gameplay as a whole, the gunplay still felt good, but everything else they brought in, it was just that's it, And finally, in terms of presentation and performance, Halo 5 had some issues. The most glaring was the fact that in the final 3 missions, I encountered a bug where the checkpoints didn't work. If I died, I had to start the mission over from the very start, which felt like shit to slog through again. This is doubly true due to how often the game will force you to stand around waiting while dialogue plays. Dialogue you've already heard 2 or 3 times before. That sucked. But at least they don't make you rewatch the cutscenes. There's a fair bit of them in Halo 5, and many of them feel like they're taking the controller right out of your hand. For example, Osiris' team is introduced in this flashy sequence where they slide down a mountainside, wiping out a bunch of foes. I guess it's supposed to look cool and make us care, but it just doesn't work. Let us feel the connection to them through playing, not through cutscenes with a forced agenda. The most egregious example of this was when I rescued Dr. Halsey at the beginning of the game, and I just had to sit there and watch as Osiris' team eliminated the new leader of the Covenant. There was potential for a cool boss fight there, and it was completely wasted with this decision. To give it some props though, the game does look pretty good. There were some different stylistic choices made, but many of the set pieces were dope to look at. Oh, also, the new ping your objective system was nice. although perhaps a little bit unnecessary. I found myself pinging a lot just because I could, not because I was lost and required actual assistance. Most of the levels are still fairly linear, so including it was probably a stretch. And yeah, I'll go ahead and throw this game a bone before wrapping up my thoughts on it. The time to heal is much more generous in 5 than 4, and it really felt nice to spend more time in action rather than waiting behind cover. Halo 5 Guardians has got to be the most try-hard game I've experienced in the franchise yet. It really felt like an amalgamation of every other Halo game I've played through already. It wanted to tell a legendary Master Chief story while including the team dynamic of ODST and Reach, while shuffling back and forth between different characters, different settings, and weapons, while trying to maintain the gameplay the series was founded on, while also introducing new melee features and a command system. And that's a whole lot of things. It feels like 343 really wanted to create the ultimate Halo experience, a game that took the best of all the previous games and smushed them into one product, regardless of whether they fit or not, and it led to a lot of clashes. So far, the series has had Master Chief games and non-Master Chief games. It's had squad-based gameplay and solo gameplay. It's had weapon evolutions that felt fresh without too much alteration, and it's found ways to balance storytelling and gameplay. In some ways, Guardians does an impressive job trying to jumble all of these conflicting elements together. However, playing the games back to back has led to a categorization of the titles based on the elements I've just outlined. And 5, it just doesn't fit well into any of them. To me, it tries too hard, and while it doesn't fall completely flat on its face, it fails in being the ultimate Halo experience that it clearly wanted to be.
Blue team, stand down!
I have a job to do.
Cortana's our concern now, sir.
Like hell she is.
And just like that, we've reached modern day with Halo Infinite. It's probably the hardest game in the series to write about because it introduces so many new elements to the franchise while also harkening back to its roots. It's a return to form mixed with a brand new approach. Meanwhile, it's also an ongoing experience, as 343 has announced that this title acts as a platform for future Halo content, which I guess means it's going to be sort of like a lighter version of Destiny to a degree. So if you're watching this in the future, know that this analysis took place before any campaign additions were tacked onto the experience. Anyway, as I was saying, Infinite is in an interesting position, as it feels like a return to games from the original trilogy, while also introducing new mechanics and ideas into the series. The most immediate change is that Infinite is an open world game, although you won't find the endless amounts of filler and recurring content you might find in other games of that genre. The open world houses large areas where a majority of main missions take place. These underground technological marvels will be your setting as you advance through the story, but a handful of quests take place in the open world itself. And that's where I want to start, by taking a look at Zeta Halo. To be perfectly blunt, it feels like 343 didn't have full confidence in designing an open world game, as very little of it feels necessary to the story being told. Instead, activities like helping soldiers, clearing bases, and finding upgrades feels more like a distraction to temporarily occupy yourself with between main quests. There's not enough side content to call it repetitive, but you will be doing the same 3 or 4 objectives repeatedly. The combat is fun enough to avoid staleness, but truly it doesn't feel like you're accomplishing a whole lot. It doesn't necessarily feel like you're making meaningful progress towards a bigger goal, but instead just killing time with some cool gameplay. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you want to focus solely on the story quests, you can do that no problem. But if you're coming into this game with the expectation of countless additional hours granted through side content, you are going to be disappointed. It makes me wonder if project leaders were afraid that dipping too far into the open world genre would upset lifelong fans of the series. Finding a point of balance seems to have been their goal, and if that's true, I think they accomplished it. I would have liked a little bit more for this open world, but at the end of the day, it's fine. Maybe a bit forgettable and lackluster, but it's fine. It's a solid foundation for more content to be built upon. And I hate to brush off such a major change to the franchise so lightly, but it does really feel like an afterthought. So let's move on to gameplay changes. With Infinite, it feels like 343 wanted to make a return to what they created in Halo 4, as well as harken back to Combat Evolved. Solid gunplay, tons of weapon variety, and a focus on linear hallway shooting sections instead of objective-based gameplay. This was a smart choice, considering Infinite serves as a platform for content over the next 10 years. So start simple and do it really well. Then build on it later. And they've done just that. Gunplay remains supremely smooth and satisfying, and there's a handful of new weapons to experiment with as well. None of them really stood out to me personally, as I opted to use returning favorites as often as possible. Still, I'm sure some players have found enjoyment with them. Regardless of what armaments you adorn, you'll immediately fall in love with the responsive and snappy aiming and firing of Halo Infinite. However, what allows this combat system to transcend past 343's previous entries was the wise choice to include a video game favorite, a grappling hook. This one tool is practical, dynamic, and ultimately so much fun to use that I honestly believe I use my melee far more in this title than any previous entry. Climbing around the open world is aided by the grappling hook, but its true presence is felt in combat, as practically everything can be grappled. You can close the gap between you and enemies and punish them with a hard-hitting melee attack. You can grapple weapons on the ground to replenish your arsenal. You can launch yourself up to the top of a platform to get a better vantage point. You can grab these explosive pillars littered throughout the battlefield to launch them at enemies for insane damage. And you can even grapple onto vehicles to enter them quickly. It has so much utility that it's impossible to not fall in love with it, especially with the momentum that it grants you. It just feels incredible to use, and when you pair that up with the already amazing gunplay, it leads to some of the best sequences in the entire franchise. There were so many times where I grappled onto enemies, punished them with melee, before turning to shoot more enemies and locate my next victim.
I need a weapon.
Weapon? This is all I've got.
It's enough.
And at the end of those violent strings of action was a sensation of satisfaction. I often found myself thinking, damn, that felt cool, and it looked cool. I loved it. It's strange then that 343 insisted on offering up additional equipment types to use, such as a shield or an enemy tracker. These can be equipped to the right bumper button, but doing so replaces whatever is already in there. Once I realized that trying these new ones would turn off my grapple hook, I never used them. The grapple felt so critical and important to the fun that giving it up for any reason just felt bad. I have to imagine the developers knew this was going to be the experience for most players, so I'm surprised they even tacked on these additional options. Perhaps it's because they wanted to include more things to upgrade. For the first time in a Halo game, you're able to use points to unlock new perks and skills. These include better shields, upgrades to your grapple, and yeah, upgrades to all those other pieces of equipment collecting dust in your inventory. You earn these by finding Spartan cores throughout the open world and using them to unlock new perks. To be honest, I never felt the need to search these out, because I found enough of them organically to upgrade the only two things that mattered to me, the grapple and my shield health. When these two elements are so far and above the rest of the options, it feels kind of like a waste of time to even include the other equipment as well as the Spartan cores needed to upgrade them. Meanwhile, for the first time in the series, there's also a distinct emphasis on boss encounters, and while it's something I've been waiting to see, in practice, it's not such a good fit. When so many enemies are capable of being downed with a full clip of ammo, it feels very strange to go up against retextured foes who can eat bullets like Cheerios. These powerful weapons you've been devastating the battlefield with are reduced to glorified pea shooters in some of these fights, as enemies seem nearly unfazed by your assault. None of the boss fights in this game felt particularly good as a result, and most of them just ended up creating a weird sensation in me because I was so used to seeing enemies melt before my eyes. It wasn't bad, it just didn't jive well into the Halo experience. So yeah, it's pretty easy to overlook a lot of these inclusions, but honestly that's because most of the time you'll be so amazed by the flow of combat and your ability to mow down enemies so seamlessly that you'll hardly be bothered to care. Infinite offers up some of the most exhilarating combat of the series by combining Halo's best-in-class shooting with a new favorite to create an FPS you just have to experience to believe. Let's hop over to the story now, where I have a lot of mixed thoughts. I should mention that the events of Halo Wars 2 takes place between Guardians and Infinite, but again, I didn't play that title for the purpose of this video. In that game, the Banished led by Atriox are established. This rogue group stood against Cortana after her subjugation of the galaxy and made progress in fighting back against her. The two forces clashed on Zeta Halo, with the Banished coming out as apparent victors. Before this, Atriox's forces overtook the UNSC ship Infinity, and in a confrontation with the Master Chief, Atriox won, throwing the legendary Spartan out into space. After drifting for 6 months, a pilot locates Chief's signal and resurrects him before the two descend to the damage ring of Zeta Halo to stop the Banished once and for all.
Wait, what? What are you gonna do? Improvise.
Throughout the adventure, Chief meets up with a new AI called the Weapon, who is essentially a carbon copy of Cortana without her memory.
They'll pair you with another AI. Maybe even another Cortana model if Halsey lets them.
That's not going to happen.
The two go about stopping the Banished by shutting down many spires and towers across the planet. They are constantly harassed and threatened by Atriox's lieutenant, Escharum, who serves as the game's main antagonist. Along with him is this weird alien lady who is from a new faction called the Endless. They were apparently trapped here on this ring by the Forerunners a long time ago and allied with the Banished to try to gain their freedom. In the end, the Master Chief, the Weapon, and the pilot stop Escharum and said weird alien lady who was called the Harbinger or something like that. I think that's what she was. But anyway, not before learning of Cortana's fate. Apparently, our former AI friend was trapped here on the ring, and knowing that she'd lose to Atriox's forces, she came to her senses, left an apology to Master Chief, and then blew herself up, damaging the ring in the process and slowing down the Banished's progress. So, we get this resolution to her story before defeating the main baddies of this title, while also learning that new threats remain with Atriox still being out there alongside of whoever the Harbinger signaled during the climax. That's not the most sufficient recap that I could write, but I've purposely left it pretty jumbled because that's exactly how it feels while playing through Infinite. Messy. I have a lot of issues with this game's story, but they are all indicative of a single problem. It's trying to do too much. Infinite attempts to wrap up Cortana's villainous arc and set her up for redemption, while also introducing a brand new faction to the FPS title in The Banished, while shoehorning in a bit about the Endless, while explaining where and what the weapon is, while also making time to discuss Chief's guilt, as well as a bunch of beats regarding the pilot. It's just too much, and none of these elements end up feeling like they got the time they needed. It's all just pedal to the metal with very little time for meaningful development. You're thrusted into the experience head first, and everything is happening so fast that it's hard to keep up with. Perhaps the most disappointing result of this is that Cortana's villain arc feels so underwhelming. After Halo 4 set things up, and Halo 5 explored her as an antagonist, Infinite feels like it's trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. It feels like so much has happened off-screen, and we're just being told about it. Maybe that's because that's exactly what happens, as the last few levels of this campaign are quite literally combat rooms divided by cutscene rooms where holograms tell you exactly what happened. Part of the excitement in video game storytelling is that you get to live through the action. This is perhaps truest in the first-person shooter genre, and here it just feels like we've already missed out on all the important bits. This is doubly disappointing when you consider how important the relationship between Chief and Cortana is to the series. It seemed like Guardians was setting this game up for a massive confrontation, but it just never happens. I don't get it. And how did Cortana even lose to Atriox when she had all those massive Guardians under her control? It's just all confusing and underexplained in a game that spends a lot of time trying to explain. It's rough. Instead, they want to emphasize the Banished a lot more throughout the story. With this game attempting to be a living experience, they needed a new faction with endless waves of enemies for us to kill. In comes the Banished to slot into that role, without a whole lot of established lore, unless you played Halo Wars 2 apparently. After how disappointing our interaction with the Didact was, Infinite spends a lot more time thrusting the villains' faces right into yours. Quite literally. There's so many hologram rooms where Escharam calls in to make threats and boasts, it's unreal. In fact, these hologram rooms are littered throughout the game so much that it contributes to that sense of being told a story rather than experiencing one. It also shows you how bad the lip syncing and facial animations are. It's also really convenient that these holograms detailing Cortana's last moments were set up to tell the story in order while also not giving away every twist and turn immediately. They play out with a portion of the story before shutting off so that you can go and kill more Banished before you get to the next slice. The result is that Infinite's gameplay and story feel more disconnected than any other game in the entire series, and that's a shame. The whole thing just felt very underwhelming and rushed, and ultimately disappointing after how big a leap of faith Guardians took with its story decisions. Weirdly enough, the only component of the narrative that I could connect with was the smallest but most novel relationship in the series, that between Master Chief and the pilot. With so much going on, it's pretty easy to write off Echo 216. But he plays an important role in reminding us of why we're doing all this, and what we've been fighting for since all the way back in Combat Evolved. We are doing this because it's our duty to protect humanity, whatever the individual cost may be. Master Chief is as stoic as always, but the pilot is wrought with emotions of guilt, fear, trepidation, pain, and anguish, but also a few fleeting moments of humanity's greatest motivator, hope.
I'm not you! I'm not a pilot! I'm not even a soldier, a marine! I'm a fraud.
He represents humanity's crossroads of what to do when faced with extraordinarily grim odds, to cave or to fight back. He shows both sides of this throughout the story. His initial excitement after recovering and restoring Master Chief is quickly wiped away as he realizes he isn't going home just yet. He's not the unyielding and unflinching super soldier that Chief is. He's just a guy hoping to get out of a bad situation. We witness him go through the frustration and pain of realizing he's not about to go home, and the eventual growth he shows by embracing his role in this fight and opting to help Chief. In the process, the legendary Spartan even shows rare glimmers of his own humanity, admitting briefly about the great sense of loss and guilt he feels about Cortana's turn to the dark side, as well as the anxiety he has towards trusting another AI.
You should leave me here with the rest of the garbage.
We all fail. We all make mistakes. It's what makes us human.
I'm sorry, Chief, but how have you ever failed?
I should have protected Cortana. Stopped everything from going wrong. I failed her. I will not fail you.
These moments would feel right out of left field unless another, more unremarkable human was there to draw them out. And that's what the pilot does. Remember when I talked about wanting to hear a more personalized story about the Master Chief? Well, this is exactly what I had hoped for. He opens up a bit without losing his stoicism or relinquishing the player's ability to immerse themselves into the character. It's handled so well despite it being Infinite's smallest story component. I loved it. And hopefully that's what Infinite is able to offer more of as the inevitable waves of new campaign content roll in during the coming years. They've already butchered the resolution to Cortana's villain arc, while offering up a decent replacement in the weapon. I'm kind of rushing past this, but she does make for a decent character in this game, and her interaction with Chief is pretty pleasant. She's fine, she's a little quirky, but she's cool, I like her. The point is, there's no going back now, so my hope is that 343 finds a way to tell interesting stories about the dynamic between Chief, New Cortana, and the pilot, while building out the culture and ideologies of the Banished and the Endless. The gameplay is ultra satisfying, so I'll no doubt be along for the ride whenever that time comes. So don't screw it up.
Yes. But at the end, he was just a soldier. Hoping he'd done the right thing.
And there you have it. My thoughts on the 8 mainline Halo games, from 2001's Combat Evolved to 2021's Halo Infinite. Before I share my final thoughts, I want to get something out of the way. Going into this project, I wanted to conclude by sharing my rankings of the titles, so let's get that over with. I mostly factored in the gameplay and the storytelling, leaving the presentation and the performance to the side. Going from my least favorite to my most favorite, we have ODST, Combat Evolved, Guardians, Infinite, Halo 2, Halo 3, Halo 4, and Halo Reach. I'm actually sort of stunned that my favorite entry is one without Master Chief, but I just connected with Reach's story more, and the gameplay was just as good. It's the most complete game, but ultimately, this isn't the point of the project, at least not anymore. At first, it was. I wanted to see which one I thought was best, but now that the console's off and the controller's resting comfortably on my shelf, I have a different perspective. As I walk away from the franchise for the first time, I feel a sense of admiration for Bungie and 343. That's mostly due to their commitment to going bold and attempting to bring something new to each entry. From their very first title, they insisted on pushing the limits of the first-person shooter genre and that effort remained obvious throughout the series. They didn't always hit a home run, and surely pissed off many hardcore fans along the way, but their philosophy of not settling and not regurgitating what has come before feels admirable. As I reflect back on this video, I can't deny how many times my previous expectations were shattered by upcoming entries. Whether it was the character-based story of Reach trumping my initial belief this structure couldn't work because of ODST, or that the gunplay couldn't get better than Halo 2, or how Halo 4 made me feel the relationship between Chief and Cortana after feeling it was pretty unremarkable in the original trilogy. These updated takes are evidence of the development studio's commitment to moving forward. Even games similar to previous entries, such as Halo 4 and Halo Infinite, each feel like their own distinct entries, whether it's due to the more personalized characters of the former or the new setting and mechanics of the latter. Every game did its own thing while making sure that gunplay rarely dipped in quality. Instead, they maintained and elevated the combat standard while finding ways to introduce fresh concepts, whether it was squad-based gameplay, or equipment, or skill trees, or through taking the story in a new direction. Each entry brought something new to the table, and I hope that's a philosophy that continues as Halo Infinite continues to grow. Combat Evolved kicked things off full throttle, and despite some bumps in the road, the series continues to blaze forward. And as I reflect on the series moving ahead, I'll remember two things: the first-in-class shooting galleries and the fun it afforded me, as well as my time spent learning the background of this universe and how Master Chief and Cortana were at the heart of it. Despite Reach being my favorite entry, it's undeniable how important Chief has been to Microsoft's gaming endeavors since day one. This formerly elusive giant has given me a new perspective, as he's quickly rose up the ranks and become one of my favorite video game characters of all time. I get it now. I understand why all my friends went crazy for him back in the day. We have a series of incredible power fantasy shooters spearheaded by a stoic legend with a heart of steel who you can assimilate yourself into. Despite the small but meaningful character development he gets throughout the series, Master Chief never fully prevented you from taking on his persona. You get to be the hero, equipped with the coolest guns and saving humanity from extinction time and time again. What could be cooler than that? Thanks for watching. Alright, so it's done. Whew, that was me sitting back in my chair a little bit. Wow, we finally made it. Thank you so much for listening to me rant and rave about this incredible series over the past 2 hours or so. If you enjoyed what you saw, I would really implore you to check out some of my other lengthy videos on the channel. I've covered a bunch of games in long format now, including a lot of the most recent Pokemon titles, as well as the entire Sly Cooper series. I also create lengthy reviews and critiques of the other latest titles releasing. I mean, this year I've already covered, let's see, there was Elden Ring, and Horizon Forbidden West, and Tunic, and a bunch of other ones I've already covered. So please check those out as well. Really, my goal was to hit 1,000 subscribers this year, and we are well on our way to that, by the way. The first 6 months of 2022 has been awesome, so I think we can get there and make this community grow, and that's what I really like. So, like I said earlier in the video, please be sure to leave your rankings and thoughts on Halo in the comments below, especially if you're a longtime fan of the series, because I want to see what you guys think. Did these thoughts that I had make sense to you? Did you feel the same? Did you feel different? And why? Anyway, so, yeah, that's it. So, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopeNapNarp. And as always, guys, have a nice day. And take care.